Before we begin, if you're new here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Now drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story reaches. I'll be reading every single one. The entire grand hall fell silent the moment the sound cracked through the air. Sharp, unthinkable, the sound of a mortal hand striking the face of the most powerful wolf alive. Alpha King Dennis Atkins did not move, did not blink, did not breathe. 500 wolves stood frozen in collective horror as the blonde girl in the red dress faced him. Her chest heaving, her hands still raised, her eyes wide at what she had just done. No one in 6 centuries of wolf rule had ever touched the Alpha King like that. No one had ever dared. Gasps tore through the hall. Guards lunged for their weapons. The nobles braced for blood. But Dennis Atkins did not call for her execution. He did not roar. He simply turned his head back toward her, slowly, deliberately, and his amber eyes burned with something the entire court had never once seen in them before. Not fury, not humiliation, recognition. And when the Alpha King finally spoke, his voice dropped so low that every wolf in the hall leaned forward just to catch the words. "Who," he said quietly, "is this woman?" The hall erupted, because the mortal girl who had just slapped the Alpha King had no idea she had already answered a question 6 years of royal selections never could. In a kingdom ruled by wolves, every noble family had spent years dreaming of the same moment. The grand bride selection. The one day each year when the Alpha King would finally look across the hall and choose. Princesses, duchesses, daughters of ancient bloodlines groomed from birth for a single purpose. And for 6 consecutive years, Dennis Atkins had ignored every single one. No explanation, no deliberation, just silence and dismissal, and a throne room full of crushed hopes. Some said he was cursed. Others said he was broken. Most believed the truth was simpler and colder. The Alpha King felt nothing, and nothing was all he would ever feel. And what happened the day a mortal seamstress walked through the wrong door and changed all of that? That is a story that would shake the kingdom to its foundations. But before we go any further, make sure you subscribe for more stories like this one. Because I promise you, this only gets more dangerous from here. Long before the slap that stopped the world, Constance Polster lived the kind of life that wolf society was designed to make invisible. Mortals were permitted in the outer villages of the realm, tolerated as seamstresses, cooks, healers, and traders, people who existed quietly at the edges of power and were expected to stay there. Constance was the daughter of a cloth merchant. Her small workshop sat at the corner of Ashmere's Market Lane, a place where wolf noblewomen occasionally stopped on their way to the capital to order gowns they would never thank her for. Every morning she rose before the sun, threading needles, cutting silk, finishing hems with the precision of someone who had learned that perfection was the only protection a mortal woman had in a wolf world. It was careful work, controlled work, and Constance had told herself for years that she preferred it that way. Her mother used to say, "In a kingdom of wolves, a mortal woman's greatest weapon is being too small to be worth the trouble." For years, Constance believed her, until the royal messengers arrived. Not the usual traders, not the polite tax collectors, the king's own men, in black and gold, bearing the crest of Alpha King Dennis Atkins, and an order Constance was not permitted to refuse. Chapter 1. Constance Polster had made 43 wedding gowns in her life and attended none of the weddings. That was the arrangement. Noble wolf families sent measurements, fabrics, and deposits. Constance sent back perfection. Hand-stitched bodices, impossible lacework, hems so precise they looked poured rather than sewn. Then the gowns disappeared into carriages bound for grand estates and cathedral halls, and Constance went back to her workbench and started the next one. She never received invitations. She never expected them. Mortals who worked for wolf families understood the boundary without being told. You may touch the silk, but you may not sit at the table. She told herself she didn't mind. Ashmere was quiet. Her workshop was warm. She had a good lamp, a sharp pair of shears, and enough commissions to keep the rent paid through winter. What more, exactly, was she supposed to want? Her mother's voice always answered that question before she could. Nothing more. Want nothing more and you'll never be disappointed. So Constance kept her head down. She woke before sunrise, brewed strong tea, and sat at her workbench while the village was still dark and still. She sewed until her fingers ached. She ate lunch standing up. She turned away commissions she didn't have time for and quietly doubled her rate for clients who treated her like furniture, which was most of them. She was precise, professional, and completely invisible, and she had convinced herself on most days that this was the same thing as safe. She was in the middle of a particularly stubborn beadwork panel, silver seed pearls along a collar that had already drawn blood from 3 of her fingers, when she heard the horses. Not the usual kind. Not the soft clop of a merchant's cart or the lazy rhythm of the village farrier making his rounds. These were heavy hooves, multiple, moving in formation. Constance set down her needle and looked out the workshop window. For riders, black and gold livery, the crest of the Adkins throne embossed on their chest plates, catching the gray morning light like a warning. She wiped her hands on her apron and told herself it was nothing. Messengers passed through Ashmere sometimes. They were probably lost. They were not lost. The lead rider dismounted directly in front of her door. The knock, when it came, was not polite. The order was simple, the messenger explained. Once she had opened the door, and he had looked around her workshop with the particular expression of someone who had expected worse and was mildly relieved. The royal grand bride selection was in 4 days. The palace required 12 ceremonial gowns altered for fit by the morning of the event. 3 of the original seamstresses had fallen ill. Her name had been provided by Lady Voss of the Northern Estate, a long-standing client, as someone whose work was reliable and whose discretion could be trusted. A cart would arrive at dawn to collect her, her kit, and whatever materials she required. She would be housed in the palace servants' quarters, compensated fairly, and returned home within a week. Constance listened to all of this with her arms crossed and her expression perfectly controlled. Then she said no. The messenger blinked. He was young, she noticed. Probably hadn't been told to prepare for no. She explained it patiently. She had existing commissions. She had a beadwork collar due in 6 days and a bridal order after that. She ran a one-woman workshop and could not simply disappear to the capital for a week without her business unraveling at both ends. She was sorry for their inconvenience. She wished them well with the remaining seamstresses. The messenger looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his satchel and produced a second document. He unrolled it slowly, held it up and said nothing, because the royal seal at the bottom said everything. A lawful requisition of services. Signed by Lord Cassius Vaughan, Chief Advisor to the Crown, under emergency provision of the Wolf Sovereignty Act. Non-compliance carried penalties she did not want listed aloud in her workshop doorway. Constance stared at the document for a long moment. Want nothing more and you'll never be disappointed. She took the document. She read it twice. She handed it back without a word, turned around, and began pulling supply cases from beneath her workbench with more force than was strictly necessary. She packed her best shears, 3 full pin cushions, her measuring cord, every spool of white and cream thread she owned, and 2 colors of silk she'd been saving for a commission that apparently was no longer her most pressing concern. She rolled her patterns and tucked them into the long leather case her mother had given her. She banked the workshop fire, latched the shutters, and left a note for her neighbor to water the windowsill herbs. The riders waited outside without speaking. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the dark of her workshop on the edge of her chair, already dressed, kit already packed by the door, and stared at the wall with the particular stillness of someone who is furious and afraid in equal measure and has decided that neither feeling will show on her face. The cart came at dawn, exactly as promised. Constance picked up her kit, walked out the door, and did not look back at the workshop, because if she had, she might have stayed. And somewhere between the royal seal and the sleepless night, Some quiet, reckless part of her had already decided she was going to see this through. She just had no idea what this was about to become. Chapter 2. The capital was nothing like Ashmere. Constance had known that, in the abstract way you know things you've only read about or heard from people who speak too loudly at market. She had known the city of Voldemort was large. She had known the Adkins Palace sat at its center like a crown set into stone. She had known, intellectually, that it would be impressive. She had not known it would make her feel like a pebble dropped into the ocean. The walls rose silver-gray against the morning sky, higher than anything she had ever seen built by hands, wolf or mortal. Wolf banners snapped in the cold wind along the battlements, deep crimson with the black Adkins crest, dozens of them, moving in unison like something alive. The gates alone were wider than her entire street in Ashmere. Noble carriages flooded the approach road in both directions, lacquered black and deep burgundy, pulled by horses that cost more than her workshop and everything in it. Footmen in livery moved between them with the practiced calm of people accustomed to orchestrated chaos. Somewhere ahead, trumpets sounded in short formal bursts, and the sound bounced off the stone walls and came back flattened and enormous. Constance sat in the back of the requisition cart with her kit on her lap and her face composed and told herself she was absolutely fine. A palace attendant met her at the servants' gate. A brisk young woman named Mira who had the clipped efficiency of someone managing 17 things simultaneously and had just been handed an 18th. She glanced at Constance, glanced at the kit, nodded once, and began walking without waiting to see if Constance would follow. Constance followed. The servants' corridors were a different world entirely from the palace face she had glimpsed through the gate. Narrow stone passages, low ceilings, the smell of beeswax and laundered linen and something warm and yeasty from the kitchens somewhere below. Staff moved past them in both directions, heads down, arms full, no one speaking above a murmur. Constance kept pace with Mira and memorized the turns out of habit. Left, right, up a half stair, left again, through a door that needed its top hinge looked at. The gowns were already waiting in the alterations room. 12 of them, hanging in a row like pale ghosts, each tagged with a name and a note about what needed fixing. Constance set down her kit, put on her pin cushion, and went to work without being asked. Mira watched her for approximately 45 seconds, decided she was competent, and disappeared. For 2 hours, Constance did what she did best. She moved down the row with quiet efficiency, letting out a seam here, taking in a waist there, resetting a neckline that had been cut an inch too wide and would have caused a catastrophe the moment its wearer lifted her arms. She did not think about the capital outside or the selection happening somewhere in the same building or the fact that she was in the palace of the Alpha King, who had never once chosen a bride and apparently intended to make that everyone else's problem indefinitely. She thought about stitches. She thought about tension and grain and the particular way silk behaved when you asked it to do something it didn't want to do. She had 3 gowns left when Mira returned and asked her to bring the completed ones to the preparation chamber on the east corridor. Constance draped 6 finished gowns carefully over her arms, accepted the directions, and set off. Left, right, up the half stair. She was fairly certain she had it. She did not have it. The half stair led to a corridor she didn't recognize, longer, wider, with a different quality of silence to it. The ceiling was higher here. The stone floors gave way to polished dark wood. The staff she'd been passing every few minutes had vanished entirely. Constance slowed, turned, and accepted that she had gone wrong somewhere after the second left. She retraced half her steps and found a door she didn't remember. Tall, dark wood with iron fittings. A sliver of gold light ran along its edge from the other side, and through it came a low sound, hundreds of people in a very large space, breathing together, not quite speaking, the particular hush of a crowd waiting for something. She pushed the door open a few inches to check if this was the east corridor. It was not the east corridor. The door opened onto the side gallery of the Grand Hall of the Adkins Palace, and the Grand Hall was occupied by what appeared to be the entire noble wolf population of the kingdom. Row upon row of them in silk and armor and ancient furs, all facing a throne carved from black obsidian at the room's far end, upon which sat the most still, most silent, most utterly detached man Constance had ever seen in her life. She stood in the doorway with 6 completed wedding gowns draped over both arms and stared. The attendant nearest her turned and went pale. "You can't be in here," he breathed. But the door had already swung wide behind her, and 300 wolf heads had already turned at the movement. And Alpha King Dennis Adkins had already lifted his amber eyes from the middle distance and found her standing there in her red dress and her pin cushion, holding other women's wedding gowns, looking like she had absolutely no idea how she had arrived at this particular moment. Which was accurate. She didn't. But she was there now. And the door had already closed behind her. Chapter 3. Constance did not move. The attendant beside her had gone the color of old milk and was making small, urgent gestures with his hands that she interpreted as please. For the love of everything, go back through that door. She understood the request. She even agreed with it in principle. But the gowns were heavy and the door was behind her and 300 wolves were already looking at her, and moving now felt somehow worse than staying still, so she stayed still and hoped the moment would pass. It did not pass. At the far end of the hall on the black obsidian throne, Dennis Adkins had already looked away. That was something, at least. His attention had returned to the center of the room, where a young woman was making her approach, walking the long marble aisle between the assembled court with the careful posture of someone who had practiced this walk for months. She was beautiful. Dark hair, ivory gown, shoulders back, chin level. She had clearly been trained for exactly this moment and was executing it with everything she had. She stopped at the appropriate distance from the throne and dipped into a formal bow. When she rose, her expression was composed and hopeful and very, very young. Dennis Adkins looked at her. That was all he did. He looked at her the way you look at a window when you're thinking about something else, present in body, entirely absent in every way that mattered. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. The young woman's composure began to fracture at the edges. A tightening around her eyes, a slight tremor in her jaw that she was fighting with everything she had and slowly losing. He blinked, slowly, and looked away. A herald stepped forward and murmured something. The young woman turned and walked back the way she had come, and her shoulders were shaking before she was halfway down the aisle, and she pressed one hand over her mouth and kept walking, and the hall watched her go in silence, and nobody did anything, and Dennis Adkins was already looking at the middle distance again with the expression of a man waiting for a weather pattern to change. Constance felt something move through her chest. Old and hot and not entirely reasonable. She had swallowed this feeling before. She had swallowed it at 12 when a wolf merchant's son tipped over her mother's fabric display and laughed while they picked it up. She had swallowed it at 19 when Lady Voss looked at a gown Constance had spent 3 weeks perfecting and said adequate without making eye contact. She had spent years becoming very good at swallowing it, wrapping it in practicality and her mother's voice and the sensible understanding that she was a mortal woman in a wolf world and the arithmetic did not favor her. The gowns were still in her arms. The door was still behind her. She set the gowns down on the gallery bench beside her and walked forward. She heard the attendant make a sound behind her that wasn't quite a word. She kept walking, down the 3 gallery steps onto the main floor of the grand hall, between the rows of staring wolves, toward the center aisle. Her boots were not quiet on the marble. Nothing about this was quiet. Every step announced itself, and every wolf in the room tracked her with the particular alertness of predators watching something that didn't understand what room it was in. She stopped in the center aisle, 10 feet from the throne, and looked at the Alpha King. He looked back. For real this time, not the absent glance he'd given her from across the room. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at most things, with total stillness and the faint suggestion that he was waiting to be disappointed. "That girl," Constance said, "walked all the way down here and you couldn't even be bothered to speak to her." The silence that followed had a physical quality. She felt it press against her ears. Dennis Adkins straightened slightly on the throne. His voice, when it came, was exactly what she would have expected, low, controlled, carrying without effort. Who are you? Constance Polster. I'm here to alter your selection gowns. She held his gaze. I took a wrong turn. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, more like the memory of it. He rose from the throne, and the room rose with him in atmosphere if not in body, the air thickening as he descended the dais steps. He was larger than she'd registered from the gallery. Gold embroidery ran across deep black robes in patterns that caught the candlelight. The crown sat on dark hair that fell to his collar, and his amber eyes were fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read and didn't particularly like. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to resist the urge to step back. A seamstress, he said, and the word landed the way he clearly intended it to. Small, categorical, finished. Her hand moved before her mind issued any instruction whatsoever. The crack split the hall like a thunderclap. Dennis Atkins turned his face slowly back toward her. His hand rose and touched his cheek. The hall was so silent she could hear her own heartbeat. Then low, rusty, genuine, like something that had not been used in a very long time. The Alpha King laughed. Chapter 4. The laugh did not last long. But it lasted long enough. Long enough for the nearest guard to forget, briefly, that he was supposed to be reaching for his weapon. Long enough for a duchess in the front row to drop her fan and not notice. Long enough for Constance to understand that whatever she had expected to happen after her hand made contact with the Alpha King's face, this was not it, and she had absolutely no framework for what came next. Dennis Atkins lowered his hand from his cheek. The laugh faded into something quieter. Not quite a smile, but the shape of where one had just been. He looked at her with an expression she still couldn't read, except that it was different from the one he'd worn on the throne. That one had been empty. This one was not. He turned to face the hall. The selection is over. 3 words. Quiet enough that the wolves in the back rows had to lean forward to catch them. Loud enough, somehow, to land like stones dropped into still water, the ripples going out and out until they hit the walls and came back as noise. The noise was considerable. Voices broke across each other from every corner of the hall. Outrage, confusion, the particular pitch of noble families who had traveled significant distances and had opinions about it. A lord near the front stepped forward with the energy of a man who had prepared remarks. Several women who had not yet made their approach looked at each other with expressions ranging from relief to fury. A herald dropped his scroll. The 2 guards flanking the dais exchanged a look that communicated, clearly, that they were not paid enough for this particular afternoon. Constance stood in the center of it all and thought, with great feeling, that she should have fixed the hinge on her workshop door instead of answering the knock this morning. Dennis spoke again, and the hall quieted the way things quiet around predators, not gradually but all at once. The selection is concluded. You will be escorted to your carriages. He turned back to Constance. She stays. The quiet shattered again, louder than before. I don't actually, Constance said. Several wolves nearby turned to stare at her with the expression of people watching someone walk towards something they shouldn't. Dennis looked at her with that same unreadable focus. You do, he said. Not cruel. Not commanding in the way she'd braced for. Almost conversational, which was somehow worse. I have 3 unfinished gowns in your alterations room and a commission due in 6 days. She kept her voice even. I appreciate the whatever this is, but I am not a bride. I am not staying, and I would like someone to point me back toward the east corridor. You're not staying as a bride. Then why am I staying? He was quiet for a moment. Around them the hall continued its controlled chaos. Guards redirecting nobles, heralds trying to restore some thread of protocol, a young woman somewhere behind Constance crying quietly into a handkerchief. Dennis seemed to notice none of it. His attention had a quality she was beginning to find deeply uncomfortable, the sense that once it landed on something, it did not wander. My wolf recognized your scent, he said, and the simplicity of it, the flatness, made it land harder than if he'd built it. The moment it did, Every unmated wolf within the city felt the resonance. Constance stared at him. "I don't know what that means." "It means," he said, with the patience of someone explaining whether to a person who has never been outside, "that you are currently the most interesting thing in Voldemort to approximately 400 wolves who are not me." He held her gaze. "I am the most controlled of them. That gap narrows considerably once you step outside these walls without my protection." The hall had quieted enough that she was aware of people listening. She was also aware that her heart had shifted into a rhythm that was not entirely attributable to residual slapping adrenaline. "You could be inventing that," she said. "I could be," he agreed. He did not add anything to it. He didn't need to. Constance looked at the doors at the far end of the hall, massive, iron-banded, currently attended by guards who were politely but firmly redirecting the departing nobles away from her general direction. She thought about Ashmere. She thought about the cart at dawn and the sleepless night before it and the 43 wedding gowns and the needle still threaded on her workbench. She thought about the young woman who had walked back down that aisle with her hand over her mouth. She said nothing, which was, she recognized, its own kind of answer. Above them, in the carved stone balcony that ran along the hall's upper level, Lord Cassius Vorn had not moved since the slap. He stood with both hands resting on the balcony rail, watching the scene below with the stillness of a man who does not waste energy on reactions he has not yet decided to perform. His eyes moved from the Alpha King to the mortal woman in the red dress and back again, and something passed through them. Not anger, not surprise, but the cool, methodical quality of a mind already 3 steps into a problem it had just been handed. He watched Dennis turn and walk back toward the inner corridor with the mortal woman beside him. Then he straightened, smoothed the front of his robes, and walked the other way. Chapter 5. The chamber they gave her was not the servants' quarters Mira had mentioned that morning. Constance noticed this immediately. The room was too large, the furniture too good, the view from the single tall window overlooking a private courtyard rather than the kitchen yard she'd been expecting. A fire had been laid and lit. The bed had 4 posts and actual curtains. On the writing table sat a candle holder with beeswax tapers, which she recognized as expensive because she had priced them for a client once and quietly decided against recommending them. She sat on the edge of the bed in her red dress with her pincushion still strapped to her wrist and thought about the particular sequence of events that had produced this moment, and whether any decision she had made today could have redirected it, and concluded that the answer was probably no from approximately the point where she had opened that door. Someone had brought her kit up from the alterations room. It sat by the writing table, packed and latched, which was either considerate or a reminder that her tools were accounted for and she wasn't going anywhere. She chose not to examine which. She had been in the room perhaps an hour when the knock came. A handmaiden, young, quiet, eyes slightly averted in the way of palace staff trained not to register anything they saw, entered carrying a tray. A goblet of wine, a small plate of bread and soft cheese, a folded cloth. She set the tray on the writing table without speaking, dipped her chin and moved toward the door. "Thank you," Constance said, because her mother had raised her to say it regardless. The handmaiden paused almost imperceptibly. Then she was gone. Constance looked at the tray. She had not eaten since the cart that morning, and the bread smelled real and the fire was warm and the wine was a deep red that caught the candlelight in a way that reminded her she had been awake since before dawn and had slapped a king since then and earned something at the end of it. She picked up the goblet, felt the cool of the metal against her palm, lifted it toward her lips. The door opened without a knock. Dennis Adkins crossed the room in 4 strides and knocked the goblet from her hand with a force that sent it spinning across the stone floor, wine arcing in a dark crescent across the hem of her dress, the sharp ring of metal on stone cutting through the room like a blade. Constance was on her feet without deciding to stand. What? He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the goblet on the floor, and the expression on his face was not the controlled flatness she'd catalogued in the hall or the unreadable focus he'd turned on her after the slap. This was something stripped of all that, something older and considerably less composed. He turned to the door. "Guards." Two appeared so quickly they must have been stationed just outside. He said something to them in a low, clipped voice that Constance only partially caught. The handmaiden's description, the tray, the wine. They moved. He looked back at the goblet on the floor, then crouched and lifted it by the rim without touching the inside, examining the residue with an attention that confirmed what her stomach had already worked out. That was poisoned, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She sat back down on the edge of the bed because her legs had made a decision about that independently. The wine. The wine. That the handmaiden brought. Yes. Constance looked at the dark stain spreading along the hem of her dress and thought, with a strange distant clarity, that she had spent 6 days on this hem and it was beyond saving now. The thought was not important. Her mind had produced it anyway, because the alternative was sitting fully inside the fact that she had been in this palace for less than 4 hours and someone had already attempted to kill her, and that was a great deal to absorb before dinner. The guards returned within minutes. The handmaiden between them had stopped being quiet. She was frightened now, visibly, and speaking in fragments that the guards assembled into a shape. A man in an upper corridor, an unsigned note, a coin pressed into her palm, and a sealed bottle already prepared that she was told to pour into the goblet before delivering it. The seal on the bottle, when a guard produced it, was a small and precise thing, a bird with folded wings over a vertical line. Dennis looked at it for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she could only describe as the closing of a door. "Cassius," he said, quietly, "the way you say a word you've known for a long time and hoped not to need." He sent the guards out. The handmaiden went with them, still shaking. The room settled back into silence, broken only by the fire and the distant sounds of the palace reorganizing itself around the wreckage of the afternoon. Constance looked at the door where they had gone, then at the stain on her dress. Then Dennis, who was standing in the center of the room with his amber eyes focused on something she couldn't see. Some interior calculation happening behind a face that had gone very still and very dangerous. "Your chief advisor just tried to kill me," she said. "Yes. I have been here 4 hours. I'm aware." She spread her hands slightly. "I make gowns. I'm from a village with 1 market lane and a broken fountain. I don't have enemies. I don't have politics. I don't have anything anyone could possibly want badly enough to." She stopped. I looked at him. "This isn't about me at all, is it?" Dennis turned his eyes to her then. The calculation was still there, but underneath it something else. Something tight and protective and not entirely controlled. "No," he said. "It's about me. And you are in the middle of it because of this morning." The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, wind moved against the window. Constance had spent her entire life being careful, staying small, wanting nothing more so she would never be disappointed. She had packed her kit before dawn and told herself she would be home in a week, and now she was sitting in a palace chamber with wine poison drying on her hem and the Alpha King standing in her room with predator's eyes, and she understood, with the particular finality of a door swinging shut behind her, that the war she had walked into through the wrong door was not one she was going to be able to simply walk back out of. She looked at the empty space on the table where the goblet had been. "I think," she said carefully, "that you owe me considerably more than seamstress wages." Dennis looked at her for a moment. Then, faintly, something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "Noted," he said. Chapter 6. The guards did not find Cassius that night. Constance learned this the way she learned most things in the palace, not by being told directly, but by reading the quality of silence around the people who knew. A guard's jaw set too tight when she asked. A maid's eyes dropped a fraction of a second too quickly. Dennis himself said nothing when he returned to her chamber an hour after the guards had gone. But the set of his shoulders said enough. Cassius Vorn was somewhere in this palace, moving through it freely, and everyone who served the crown was caught between two authorities and choosing their steps carefully. She had changed out of the wine-stained dress and into the spare she'd packed. Plain dark wool, practical, nothing that would catch candlelight. She was sitting at the writing table with her kit open in front of her, rethreading needles, because her hands needed something to do and the alternative was sitting with them folded in her lap thinking about poison goblets and closed doors. Dennis stood near the window with his back to the room, looking out at the dark courtyard below. He had removed the crown. She noticed this in the peripheral way she noticed structural things. The absence of it changed the line of him, made him look less like a symbol and more like a person, which was somehow more unsettling than the crown had been. "I need to ask you something," he said, without turning. "You're going to anyway," she said, not unkindly. He turned then. In the firelight, without the formal weight of the throne room around him, his face was harder to keep at a distance. She focused on the needle. "There's a way to determine whether the bond is real," he said. "Whether what my wolf sensed this morning is what I believe it to be, or something that will fade by morning and leave us both with a more manageable problem." Constance set the needle down. "How?" "Contact. Skin to skin. If the bond exists, both parties feel it simultaneously. There's no mistaking it and no manufacturing it." He paused. "One touch. That's all it requires to confirm." She looked at him across the room. "And if it is confirmed? Then we know what we're dealing with. And if it doesn't?" Something moved through his expression. "Then you finish the gowns and go home to Ashmere and we tell the court this was a misunderstanding." Constance considered this for longer than she wanted to admit. The sensible part of her, the part that had been running her life for 26 years with reasonable success, pointed out that a negative result was the preferable outcome by almost every practical measure. She could go home. She could finish the commission. She could reinstall herself in the life she had built around invisibility and tell herself, eventually, that she had once taken a wrong turn in a palace and it had not amounted to anything. "One touch," she said. "One touch." She pushed back her chair and stood. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close but not crowding. He turned his right hand, palm up, between them and waited, which she had not expected. She had expected him to simply take her hand, because he was a king and kings in her experience did not stand with open palms and wait. This was a question, not a command. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She placed her hand in his. The world ended and rebuilt itself in the space of a single heartbeat. It was not like touching a hot stove. Not pain, not shock exactly, though it moved through her like both. It was more like being suddenly and completely submerged in something vast and ancient, something that had been waiting at a depth she hadn't known existed in her, and it rose up all at once and took the room with it. The chamber was gone. The fire was gone. She stood under an open sky bleeding red at the edges. A blood moon, enormous, hanging over a landscape she didn't recognize. Beside her stood a wolf. Silver gray, massive, entirely still, its shoulder level with her own. And in front of them, impossibly, a kingdom, stretching out in the dark and bowed. Not in defeat, in recognition. A voice came from everywhere and nowhere, neither loud nor soft, just present the way gravity is present. The king who sees nothing will only be made whole by the one he could not ignore. Then it was gone. The chamber snapped back. Fire, stone walls, the smell of beeswax and wool. Constance stumbled back a half step and Dennis released her hand as if it had burned him, which it had burned them both, and they stood 2 feet apart, breathing like they had each run a significant distance and staring at each other with the expressions of people who have just been shown something they cannot unknow. The silence lasted a long time. Constance looked at her hand, then at him, then at the fire, then back at him because there was nowhere else to look that helped. "That was," she said carefully, "deeply inconvenient." Something crossed Dennis Adkins's face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, close enough that she felt it land somewhere in her chest before she could stop it. "Yes," he said quietly. "It was." Outside, the blood moon hung over Voldemort and the wolf banners moved in the dark wind, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking. That inconvenient was a very small word for what was coming. Chapter 7. The summons arrived before sunrise. Constance was already awake. She had not slept well, which felt like a reasonable response to the previous day's events. Sitting at the writing table with a candle and the unfinished beadwork collar she had packed from Ashmere out of habit, and was now working on because her hands still needed something to do and the needlework asked nothing of her except precision. She heard boots in the corridor, more than one pair, moving with the particular purposeful rhythm that distinguished official palace movement from ordinary foot traffic. She set down the collar and folded her hands on the table and waited. The knock was formal. 3 measured beats. 2 council guards. Full dress livery. Expressions arranged into the careful blankness of men delivering a document they had not written and did not intend to editorialize about. The summons was on heavy cream paper with 3 different seals along the bottom edge. She read it once, set it down, read it again. Constance Polster, mortal citizen, is hereby called before the High Wolf Council to answer a formal charge of interference with sovereign wolf instinct through the use of prohibited mortal enchantment, corruption of the royal selection process, and unlawful manipulation of the Alpha King's bond response. She looked up at the guards. This is Cassius. Neither of them confirmed or denied this. She hadn't expected them to. She picked up the collar, took 3 more stitches with the focused calm of someone completing a thought before standing, and then set it down and went to find her shoes. The judgment hall was older than anything else she had seen in the palace. Older stone, lower ceiling, the weight of centuries pressed into its walls like sediment. It was also, somehow, larger than the Grand Hall, or felt that way because the Grand Hall had been full of silk and politics and the performative pageantry of the selection. This room had none of that. It had 500 wolves arranged in tiered stone seating that curved around a central floor, and the combined attention of 500 wolves in a confined space had a physical quality, like weather. Constance walked to the center floor between the 2 guards and stood there in her dark wool dress with her hands at her sides and looked straight ahead and did not perform composure. She simply had it, or something close enough to it that the distinction wouldn't matter to anyone watching. Cassius Vorn stood at the advocate's position to the left, a raised stone lectern that had been worn smooth by centuries of hands. In the throne room she had only seen him from a distance. Up close he was older than she'd registered, silver-haired, precise in his dress, with the kind of face that gave nothing away because it had spent decades deciding what to give and what to keep. He looked at her once when she entered briefly, with the assessing quality of someone checking that a piece has been placed correctly on a board. Then he looked away. The council filed in. 12 wolves in formal robes taking their seats along the curved upper dais. Then the doors at the far end opened, and the hall rose. Dennis entered without the crown. She noticed this again, the second time in 12 hours he had appeared without it, and she wondered whether it was deliberate and concluded that with him most things probably were. He took his position at the sovereign's seat, a stone chair set apart from the council dais, neither elevated above Constance nor beside her. Watching. He looked at her once across the hall with an expression she had catalogued enough by now to read. Contained, alert, and doing something careful underneath. Cassius began. She would grant him, extraordinarily good at this. His case assembled itself with the elegance of something that had been constructed over days, perhaps longer. He had witnesses, 2 selection attendants who confirmed the disruption, a herald who confirmed the abrupt end of the ceremony, a palace physician who offered carefully worded testimony about the unusual nature of the bond response given the subject's mortal status. He had precedent, 3 citations from wolf law spanning for centuries, each one covering a different facet of the charge. He had, most devastatingly, logic, because the argument that a mortal woman accidentally wandering into a selection and producing a bond response in an Alpha King who had felt nothing for 6 consecutive years was simply too improbable to be accidental was not, on its face, an unreasonable thing to say. He said it beautifully. The hall listened. Several council members made notes. When he finished, the head of the council turned to the center floor. The accused may respond through appointed. The bond vision said the king who sees nothing, Constance said. The hall went quiet with the specific quality of a room in which someone has just spoken without being invited to. The council head stared at her. You will wait for. I'm responding to the charge. She kept her voice even. He said the bond response was manufactured. But the bond produced a vision with specific language neither of us knew beforehand, witnessed by both parties simultaneously. You cannot enchant a vision into someone else's mind and also experience it yourself from the other side. That's not how enchantment works. That's not how anything works. She looked at Cassius. If I had the ability to construct a shared prophetic vision and plant it in the Alpha King's wolf instinct, I wouldn't be spending my days hemming other women's wedding gowns in Ashmere. A sound moved through the hall. Not quite laughter, not quite agreement, something between the two. Cassius had not moved. His expression had not changed. But his eyes had sharpened by a fraction that she suspected very few people in this room were positioned to notice. The council head drew breath to speak. She speaks for herself. Dennis's voice crossed the hall without effort. 4 words. Quiet. Absolute. The council head closed his mouth. Every head turned toward the sovereign's seat. Dennis had not moved from it, had not raised his voice, had not done anything except say the words with the particular quality of someone laying a stone down and being finished with the conversation about whether the stone belonged there. The hall was very still. Cassius looked at the Alpha King for a long moment. Something passed between them, old, complicated, the residue of years, and then Cassius looked back at his lectern and straightened one of his papers with a precise, unhurried motion. He was not finished. Constance could feel it. But for this moment, in this silence, she was still standing. Chapter 8. The council deliberated for 11 minutes. Constance knew this because she counted. Not the seconds exactly, but the slow measured beats of her own pulse while she stood on the center floor and the 12 council members conferred in the low, urgent murmur of people negotiating between what the law said and what the moment required. She did not look at Dennis. She did not look at Cassius. She looked at a fixed point on the far wall and breathed the way her mother had taught her to breathe before difficult client meetings. Steadily, from the bottom of the lungs, giving nothing away. The head of the council stood. The right of Ash, he said, had not been invoked in 140 years. It was not invoked lightly. But the charge was serious, the evidence was contested, and the law was clear. When the council could not reach a unanimous verdict on a matter touching the sovereign bond, the ancient trial would determine what argument could not. 3 challenges. The accused would face each in sequence. Completion of all 3 constituted full acquittal. Failure at any point constituted confirmation of the charge. He did not specify what confirmation of the charge would mean. He didn't need to. Constance was taken to the arena through a corridor that smelled of old stone and something animal underneath it, something that had been in the walls a long time. The arena itself was a circular chamber beneath the judgment hall, lower, rawer, lit by iron torch brackets set into the walls rather than chandeliers. The stone floor was dark with the history of use. The tiered seating above was already filling as the council and the assembled court relocated to the observation balconies that ringed the upper level. She found Dennis in the crowd above and held his gaze for 2 seconds before the first gate opened. The fire challenge was straightforward in the way that things are straightforward when the only requirement is to walk through them and not stop. A channel of flame, 6 feet wide, sustained by mechanisms she couldn't see, running the width of the arena floor. Wolves navigated it on instinct, their bodies running warmer, their pain tolerance calibrated differently, the fire reading them as kin rather than fuel. For a mortal it was simply fire, which burned, which she was not built to withstand in the way the trial assumed. She took off her outer layer, wrapped it around her forearms, and walked through it without running because running would have been worse and because the watching mattered as much as the surviving, and she understood that much about the room she was in. She came out the other side with singed fabric and a burn along her left forearm that she assessed quickly and decided was manageable and then stopped assessing because the second gate was already opening. Darkness. Complete and absolute. Not the darkness of a room with curtains drawn, but the darkness of a space specifically constructed to remove all light and all sound and return the occupant to something very old and very alone inside their own skull. Wolves navigated it on scent and hearing and the bone-deep assurance of creatures who had never been at the bottom of any food chain. Constance navigated it by putting one hand on the wall and moving forward and refusing, with considerable effort, to think about what else might be in the dark with her. Something was. She heard it breathe. She did not stop moving. She found the far door by touch and pushed through it into the torchlight and did not look back at whatever had been behind her, because looking back was a concession she was not prepared to make. The third gate was larger than the others. She heard the ash wolf before she saw it. A sound that was not quite a growl and not quite anything else. A sound that seemed to come from somewhere beneath hearing and register directly in the part of the brain responsible for the oldest decisions. The gate rose and the creature entered the arena, and Constance understood immediately and completely why it was last. It was enormous, gray-white, almost colorless, moving with the slow, deliberate quality of something that had never once needed to hurry. Its eyes were pale amber, nearly white, and they found her instantly and stayed. The crowd above had gone completely silent. The ash wolf was trained, the council head had explained, to respond to will, specifically to break it. It did not attack the body first. It attacked the capacity to stand. It stared at her and the pressure of it was immense and physical, like a hand pressing down on the top of her skull, and Constance felt her knees suggest, quite strongly, that the floor was an option. She did not take the floor, but it was close. It was very close and getting closer, the pressure building in concentric rings, and she was gripping the last of herself with both hands when the wolf decided it was done waiting and lunged. She had no plan for this part. She didn't need one. Dennis landed between them from the balcony above, a 12-foot drop that he absorbed without pausing, and straightened to his full height with his back to her and his face to the wolf and his royal cloak still moving from the fall. The ash wolf skidded on the stone floor and reset, head low, reassessing. Dennis reached back and unclasped the cloak at his throat. It fell. He stood without it in the torchlight, and then he spoke. Not to the wolf, not to Constance, but to the entire hall above them in a voice that carried every frequency of authority she had heard from him and several she hadn't. The mate bond declaration was old language, older than the palace, older than the council, older than the laws that had spent the last day trying to determine whether Constance Polster deserved to live. She didn't understand the words. She felt them anyway, the way she had felt the vision, from the inside out, settling into her chest like something that had been looking for that specific place for a very long time. The ash wolf went still. His pale eyes moved from Dennis to Constance. It lowered its enormous head by degrees, slowly, heavily, with the gravity of something ancient performing an act it had not performed in a very long time. It bowed. The council chamber above them erupted. Voices crashing over each other. Someone shouting procedure. Someone else shouting something that wasn't a word at all. The oldest council member had both hands pressed flat on the balcony rail and was staring down with an expression of pure stunned reckoning. Cassius Vaughan stood motionless at the far end of the balcony. Every other face in the hall was animated. Shock, outrage, awe, fury. His was not. It had gone the specific white of a man watching something he had spent years preventing complete itself in front of him, and finding that he has run entirely out of moves. Dennis turned to face Constance. She was still standing. Barely, but standing, which she felt was worth noting given the preceding 10 minutes. The burn on her forearm had stopped being something she could set aside and was now firmly demanding her full attention, and her legs had renegotiated their terms considerably, and she was reasonably certain she was going to need to sit down in the very near future. But she met his eyes across the arena floor, and she did not look away. Chapter 9. They brought her a chair eventually. She hadn't asked for one. She had been making a point of standing, which felt important in the way that small dignities feel important when larger ones are under negotiation. But the burn on her forearm had made its case persuasively enough that when a guard appeared at her elbow with a low wooden chair, she sat in it without argument. A palace physician followed shortly after, knelt beside her without ceremony, and began working on the burn with the focused efficiency of someone who had patched up arena injuries before and had opinions about people who waited too long to mention them. Above, the council chamber was still loud. She could hear it through the stone, the shape of the argument if not the words, the particular rhythm of institutions trying to absorb something that doesn't fit their existing architecture. The ash wolf had withdrawn through its gate with the unhurried dignity of a creature that had delivered its verdict and considered the matter closed. The arena floor was very quiet by contrast. A torch bracket had loosened in the commotion and one flame was guttering sideways. Nobody had fixed it yet. Dennis stood a few feet away, watching the physician work, saying nothing. He had retrieved his cloak from the floor and held it folded over one arm, not worn, just held, like he hadn't decided yet what to do with it. The physician finished, wrapped the forearm in clean linen, and left with a small bow. Constance looked at the bandaging, then at the guttering torch, then at Dennis, who was already looking at her. "The oldest elder is coming down," he said. "I gathered. The formal confirmation will take approximately 10 minutes. After that, the council ruling on Cassius will be read." And then, he didn't answer immediately. She had learned that his silences were not evasions. They were the spaces where he moved something from one place to another before speaking, the internal relocation of something that mattered to him. The door from the upper level opened. The oldest council member descended the narrow stairs to the arena floor with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body required negotiation on stairs and who was too dignified to acknowledge it. He was ancient in the specific way that felt geological, not frail, just accumulated. He carried a small leather-bound record book and his hands, Constance noticed, were not entirely steady. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long moment over the top of the book. She looked back. "I have sat on this council," he said, "for 51 years. I witnessed the last rite of ash. I have read the bond declarations in the old records." He paused. "I have never seen the ash wolf bow." Constance said nothing because nothing seemed necessary. He opened the record book. He read the confirmation in old formal language that she followed approximately half of, but the shape of it was clear, the bond acknowledged, the charge dismissed, the trial closed. When he finished, he looked at her again with those wide, still reckoning eyes, and then he looked at Dennis, and then he closed the book and went back up the stairs without further comment, which she respected enormously. The council chamber above had gone quiet. Then, muffled through stone, a single voice reading something official, clipped, formal, final. Cassius Vorn's name. Several charges listed in sequence. Constance caught removal and suspension of authority and pending full inquiry and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite relief but was adjacent to it. Then quiet again. Dennis walked toward her and stopped, and he was not wearing the crown and not wearing the cloak, and the torchlight was doing nothing formal with his face. It was just his face, which she had been looking at for one of the strangest days of her life, and which she had catalogued more thoroughly than she had intended to. He did not speak immediately. When he did, his voice was different from the voice that had crossed the hall in the judgment chamber, different from the voice that had spoken the bond declaration in old language that landed in her chest like something finding its place. This was quieter, more careful. "You don't have to stay," he said. Constance looked at him. "I mean it. The bond is confirmed. The charge is dismissed. Cassius has been removed. You could go back to Ashmere. I would ensure your safety on the road, and I would not." He paused, relocating something again. "I would not make it difficult." She looked around the arena. The dark stone, the old torches, the gate through which the ash wolf had come and gone. She thought about the grand hall above them, and the black obsidian throne, and the wolf banners she had seen from the cart that morning snapping in the cold wind over silver walls that had seemed, 12 hours ago, like the most foreign thing she had ever seen. She thought about the beadwork collar on the writing table upstairs, 3 stitches from finished. She thought about the way he had dropped from that balcony without hesitating, without calculating, without doing anything except placing himself between her and the thing coming for her, and the cloak falling, and the old language filling the arena from the floor up. She stood from the chair. The red dress caught the torchlight, wine-stained at the hem, singed at the sleeve, still red. She held out her hand. not as an answer to a command, as an answer to a question, which was what he had asked, which was what she had noticed, which mattered more than she had expected it to matter when the day began. Dennis looked at her hand for one long moment. Then he took it, and the bond settled between them like something exhaling after a long time held. Warm and certain and not shocking anymore, just true. He looked at her the way she had watched him fail to look at anyone in that hall above them. Fully, without the absence. Like she was the fixed point he had been looking for since before he knew he was looking. She did not tell him that this was inconvenient. It had stopped being inconvenient somewhere around the balcony. "I have 3 gowns to finish," she said instead. "I know," he said. "And the beadwork collar. I'll have it brought to a better room." Outside the palace, the wolf banners moved in the night wind over Valdenmoor, and somewhere in the city below, the news was already traveling street by street in the way that impossible things travel. Faster than reason, louder than doubt. The Alpha King who had ignored every bride in the realm had finally looked at someone. A mortal seamstress in a red dress who had taken a wrong turn and slapped him and survived the rite of ash and taken his hand in an empty arena at the end of the longest day either of them had ever lived. She had not asked for a crown. She suspected one was coming anyway. She decided, standing in the torchlight with her bandaged arm and her ruined hem and his hand warm around hers, that she would deal with that tomorrow.